Hey, so today I want to talk about good and bad art. Specifically, what makes a good or bad film? Why is Oppenheimer, in my opinion, a good film, and Barbie and Sound of Freedom not? I've already talked about Barbie a bit in a previous video or two, and within that uh, last video that I did, I suggested that there was a good, solid, tragic core to the film that could have been developed. Instead, it was covered over by a kind of propaganda melodrama, basically a message that didn't actually even coincide with the true dramatic structure of the film. In The Sound of Freedom, there's a similar thing going on where I felt a lot of sympathy for, rightly so, as most people would watching the film, sympathy for the children that are being trafficked in the film. Both of these films have been heavily politicized, and oftentimes the real problems with them are covered over as well by other propaganda, other political narratives about the right or the left. But the problem isn't really about politics, it's about the way that truth is framed within meaningful narratives. In our very liberal culture, everybody wants to have the truth, and it's the other guy who's spinning it or lying. Now, lying is especially something we want to uncover with the truth, but more often than not, there's some truth in every side, but the actual way that it gets framed is very different because of different values. This doesn't mean that one side is right and the other side is wrong, but what we can do is look at the way that that frame, that narrative, is working on us, and is it helping us understand things better? Or is it just trying to convince us either of what we already believe, or perhaps win us over to the side of good, right, true, and get us to double down on our hatred or change our alliances and affiliation with one side or the other? Now, James Joyce, in his great book, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he discusses two types of art. The proper art he calls static, a term I don't so much like, but you have to understand by static, he doesn't mean that it doesn't do anything. He means that it actually stops you from doing your whole thing of identification, your judgment, and your opinions. He says it arrests the mind and it connects it with its secret cause. He means here to imply that there's a kind of universal sympathy that arises, especially in tragic art, right? Because we're meant to see both sides of the conflict instead of identifying with one or the other. The bad art he calls kinetic because it's actually reinforcing that activity that you have to kind of identify and to decide and be especially very active in your desire to actually often even grab and hold and seize the object of art. This is especially true in pornography, right? We're driven to action. We want and desire the object of the art, the beautiful woman or man or whatever. In propaganda, we're meant to desire the ends that are propagandized in the narrative. We want to do something about whatever it is, the film or documentaries, especially, tend to be this way. Whatever they're about, we're convinced, right? We're not really generally opened up to the complexity of an issue. This can definitely be done in documentaries, but they especially tend to be one-sided. Film, often in general, is propaganda, melodrama, and advertising for some kind of idea or another. So that brings the question to mind: can we put a message or an idea into a work of art without it becoming a kind of cheap melodrama? With Christopher Nolan, I think we see a struggle with this, an attempt to kind of always have some kind of overarching idea or philosophy at work. And he's often criticized for that. But in his recent film, Oppenheimer, I think we see him at his best, where he's able to kind of bring some deep ideas to his work without having it overrun the narrative with some kind of heavy-handed message. Most of his films are complex, and so he doesn't tend to devolve into melodrama, but he does tend to struggle on some level with this problem of how to put ideas into art without them overrunning the art and ruining the kind of empathetic possibilities of especially film. And film is great at that. You know, it's so immersive, and especially Christopher Nolan's work. I think even when he lets ideas and his intellect and philosophy overrun character, his films are very immersive. He uses IMAX cameras generally lately, and especially in Oppenheimer, we're led into a kind of onslaught of the emotions of this main character. We're almost not even given a choice to empathize or not. It's especially if you see it in IMAX or in theaters, you're just overwhelmed with the experience of being this person. Great narratives, great film. This is what they should do. They should help us do both. We should be able to empathize and to think. But that's different than when something moves your mind to judge or to make conclusions. Very different than something that makes you think, that makes you empathize with something more than just a person or a point of view, but you're actually seeing the tapestry of ideas and feelings and perspectives. And there's a tragic component to that often because they don't always get along. In The Sound of Freedom, the subject is something particularly heinous, dark, full of possible empathy that we could have for children being trafficked. But it gets a bit ruined, as Barbie did, by this political message. And the irony is that the message is about how we should care about things like child pornography, but pornography is, in a way, a species of exactly what this film is guilty of. And it actually kind of touches on this a bit, where the main character has to watch child porn as part of his job, busting pedophiles, right? And at one point he pretends to empathize with the pedophile and says, "Oh, watching all this, I'm taken in by it, and now I'm one of you." In the film, though, he's doing this completely as a ruse to get the pedophile to divulge information. Now, one could argue that the Christian conservative mythology, in a way, is a species of this same kind of pornographic fascination with purity and its corruption. The pedophile, one could argue, longs for the purity of childhood, but it's mixed up with their very adult sexual desires in a way that's unhealthy and potentially very dangerous for society. But in a way, the Christian conservative belief that there's a pure, good world that's contaminated by evil, or a pure, good capitalism that's contaminated just by evil people that, like the government and libertarian ideology, or just the evil, lowly people that engage in heinous acts, or they become conjoined, and the two are the same, as in some of the more recent QAnon conspiracy theories about the government being pedophiles, which kind of completes their mythology, right? Now, whether this is true or not is kind of besides the point. Too much of the liberal backlash against this film and against this kind of conspiracy theory in general centers around how ridiculous it is or not. It very well might have some truth to it. In fact, with the recent controversy surrounding Jeffrey Epstein, we know that some type of collusion between powerful people and human trafficking and sex workers of underage, perhaps, have some kind of basis in reality, right? But the irony is that this is part of a control mechanism in society, from what we're seeing, from what we know at least, what little has been released about what's really going on with the Epstein scandal, is that they use the extreme dehumanization of people that engage in anything like this as a way to trap people and to control them. And this kind of mythology that makes people with the mental illness of pedophilia out to be a heinous, inhuman act are just feeding into the fear around this that allows people to be trapped. Now, this may have nothing to do with pedophilia. It may have everything to do with just getting people to do something that is unforgivable by society, so that you have something on them that they will do anything to prevent people from finding out. This is the irony of demonizing something, so something that becomes so demonized that it becomes an easy way to control people. And the fascination that conservatives have with purity and its corruption is a similar thing that child pornographers have as well, right? They have this kind of attraction to what went wrong here, and it's something that needs to be healed, both in the mainstream political sense and in the more extreme mental illness of pedophilia. But this is not helped by films like this, which just stoke the controversy. The liberals denouncing the film end up sounding pretty silly about, when they denounce it, it sounds like they're just turning their back on a very real issue, and people downplaying Jeffrey Epstein, downplaying these kinds of things going on in the power structure, also seem to miss the boat of how these kinds of political narratives help divide society and control people. Movies that are geared towards dividing people, getting them to identify with one side or another of some good-evil divide, it's one of the worst things that's happening in society. This topic of human trafficking and child pornography could have been handled in a way that allowed us to understand that there is no purity. There is no pure good and pure evil. That we all have the potential to do maybe not some of these more heinous acts, but maybe, who knows, in what circumstance. People going to see this movie in the first world and not being brought up in the traumatic circumstances of especially the third world, where a lot of this stuff goes on in its most heinous form, feel a righteous justification and condemnation that doesn't help us understand and take care of the problem. Capitalism has turned a lot of the world into slaves of one sort or another, some more comfortable than others, but this isn't just an isolated problem done by evil men. Friedrich Nietzsche famously critiqued Christianity as being the source of this unhealthy concept of evil, contrasting it with earlier forms where the divide was not between a pure good and a pure evil, but between the lowly and bad and the good and great. And so we achieve the good and the great by overcoming and rising above the lowly and bad, not by destroying an evil that has been put on the other side of a absolute boundary. Art that deals with this kind of complex structure helps us kind of understand how we're all involved in the evil things in the world in some form or another. Doesn't mean we all could be pedophiles, but it does mean that the kinds of mental illness and violence and suffering in the world are connected with our own struggles with purity, with good versus evil, with juggling our different impulses and how they relate to the rest of the world. We're all politicized at the most fundamental level of our being. By that I mean every choice, every feeling and emotion and thought that we have has an effect on the world. And the problem with so many like melodramas and documentaries and politically oriented films is that they get us to focus on one issue as if it is isolated and something that can be understood apart from everything else. Now, granted, tackling individual issues is important, and we can't always just be focused on the big picture. But if you don't see the big picture, you can't really solve problems. You can just kind of attack the surface phenomenon, like, oh, it's just about these evil people kidnapping children. And just to mention, like, yeah, the movie depicts kidnapping as being a main part of the human trafficking phenomenon when it's actually a very small part. In large part, it's people being exploited by their own families and conditions that make them ripe for that kind of exploitation. It's not about just a few evil people. It's a whole system that pushes people into exploitative behavior. And we're all involved in it. We all have a part to play and a political struggle within our own heart to become more aware of. Art can really do that. It can really help us empathize. Not to see ourselves in a child pornographer, but to see that their struggle with good versus evil, purity versus impurity, is not so stark. That it's a version of the things that we're all struggling with what is good. How do we overcome the bad? This is done much more artfully in Christopher Nolan's film Oppenheimer. There is a kind of bad guy in the film. Robert Downey Jr.'s character is portrayed as being kind of a scheming evildoer in a lot of ways. But we still have empathy for him, and we don't see him as being essentially something different than the system. He's part of the system. He's just an extreme version of the system. His ambition, his selfishness, his impurity is not about being essentially different and corrupting an otherwise pure system. It's an extreme. And this is a version of evil that people like Aristotle and a favorite of mine, Rudolf Steiner, talked about. Steiner even has a whole Christian mythology coming out of Nietzsche, educating Christianity in the Western tradition with Nietzschean ideas, where evil is not some radical other, but the extremes. He has a Lucifer and an Ahriman as extreme poles that need to be balanced, that the demonic becomes demonic only in the extreme, but then the Christ, the true center and heart of Christianity, is this moderation of the extremes. In Oppenheimer, we are given this quite complicated character as a protagonist, and he is not molesting children, but he's building a weapon that could potentially end all life on the planet. But this is not some evil deed. He struggles with it throughout the whole movie. Is it good? Is it right? Is it bad? What justifies the creation of such a weapon? He struggles with it, so he is our hero because he's struggling it within himself. And the system is part of him, and he is part of the system. They're not separate. The system isn't demonized either. This is the main issue between conservatives and liberals. Liberals tend to kind of blame the system, and conservatives blame evil people. But the system is made by people, and people are made by the system. Both of these things are important, and we have to understand there is no pure other. They're just extremes. And these extremes are reflections of things in us. And we are able to overcome them and understand them and work with them and improve them by seeing how they relate to us. And that empathy that can be promoted and intensified through great art and great film can be a great ally in this quest for understanding and improving the tragic problems of our world. But I also don't want to demonize these films and demonize propaganda. we can look at it and appreciate it for what it is and understand and empathize with the problems that it's trying to address. The Sound of Freedom has a tragic component to it that does make you feel empathy for the great suffering that is happening in the world, especially with children. And that's good. There are good things I like about this movie and Barbie as well, as I've previously discussed. Oppenheimer, though, I think does a much better job at helping us understand that the moral problems of our time are not isolated, that they're not just about one man, one great man or terrible man struggling with the power to end the whole world. He's a product of a system, and a system that we're all creating. We're all creating. We're all manifesting out of the moral struggles that we're all going through. And a great film and great art in general can help arrest our judgments, arrest our mind, as James Joyce says, and help connect it with this deeper source of empathy, not just emotion in the sense of, oh, I feel for this person, but I also understand them. I understand how this happened. Ideas can work in film, and I would argue that art without ideas, art that's just about feeling, is incomplete.